we're back again with a brand new episode of the Totally Indian Football Show with me, your host Siju. And once again, I'm really thrilled to announce you this particular guest on my show. Once again, I have connected with him on Twitter. I just randomly happened to send him a DM and just try my luck to see if I can actually get him on the show. And here we are today. You're listening to him on my show. Martin Lowe, he's a journalist, a well renowned journalist. He currently works for the Asian Game. I think this would definitely be a good episode for all our Indian football audience as well as to know what's happening in Asia. Martin, welcome to the show.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to come onto a podcast that is doing great things for not just Indian football, but I think covering a lot of Asian aspects. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for those kind words. So let's kick off with things that a little bit about you and your journey of probably being one of the renowned journalists covering the Asian football. How did that happen?
I wouldn't call myself necessarily renowned, but there we are. I've always been obviously interested in kind of world football and more specifically in Asian football from when I was younger. So as most people probably know, I'm not from Asia at all. I haven't really got a connection to Asia. I'm based in the United Kingdom. Kind of locationally wise, probably nearest the biggest city is Liverpool, so I'm just outside Liverpool. But my interest in kind of Asian football kind of got sucked in with the guys at Sandals for Goalposts. I was good friends with them in terms of looking at Asian football and African football about 10, 15 years ago. And they were kind of asking for kind of extra kind of content providers from that point of view. So I did a couple of previews for, I think the World Cup at that stage was probably the 2010 World Cup. And then it kind of snowballed from there. You take a little sample of kind of elite Asian football, and then next week you're watching kind of second tier Kyrgyzstan football. So it goes from one extreme to the other. So it's been a whirlwind of kind of last 10 years, and joined the Asian Game 3 years ago with Paul Williams and Scott McIntyre and Michael Church. And it's a platform that we've tried to kind of grow and to be kind of the defining voice, if possible, of Asian football in English and trying to cover from kind of east to west all that's going on in there.
Yeah, that's interesting to say that, because how was your perception changed, or were you surprised at the things that you got to know? Because here you are, grown up amidst proper English football competition, and Premier League or even the Championship down there is something widely spoken of, widely watched across the globe. And then you have a sudden shift to not just watching Asian football, but also covering that aspect. So how was that for you?
It's always been something I've been interested in, looking for a bit more detail. And I think that's probably why I've always kind of reached out to kind of leagues that people don't see very often. There isn't much written about it. And that's why I always reached out to the guys from Sandals Goalpost, because they were doing a lot of work, especially in African football, in terms of trying to shed a bit of light on those areas. And especially from somebody that's lives and works in England, there's a kind of a stereotypical view of Asian football, be East Asian football in terms of what we see Japanese and Korean football, and then most recently Middle Eastern football in terms of how Qatar and Saudi Arabia play. And I think it's very stereotypical, it's very one-dimensional, and hopefully as the work we try and do is try and bring a bit of colour, a bit of nuance to that kind of debate. So fingers crossed we can do that.
Great. I think it's always good to know, because even from our perspective, we also sometimes think from the English or the European perspective, though we are on this side of things, because I think that's what the World Cup showed us that happened in Qatar, right? How we were all together surprised to see Asian countries do really well. But the fact of the matter is that there is a lot of hard work put in there and efforts put in there by the teams on this side as well. And I think football is changing. It's never been the same as it was probably when it started on day one. So we really can't stick to one way of playing it, right? Coming to the point of when you then extensively started covering what has been your experience like with regards to football happening in every region? Because we are divided in the west, east, there are different zones here. And, the football across is different because the systems that they follow, countries in general may not be doing that great. But when you come to the football map of things, they are pretty good at it. So, how do you see all those, the geography, the politics of it, all of being involved very heavily and evident? So, how do you see their football growing, in this aspect of the world?
I think that's the other kind of aspect to that, being a neutral, having no play in the game. As you mentioned about kind of, there's a lot of focus from Asia on English football, and it's quite odd that I'm looking in from the opposite direction in terms of that. Asia's, and we might get onto it in a discussion in terms of, there's been discussions in the last kind of 6 months about Russia's inclusion and whether that will kind of come to pass. But the size of Asia is unimaginable. It's a continent that it should be 2, 3 continents in size. And you can see that by culture, by the style of football that's been played, about what focus, what's important, what's not. And it's also not playing together as one. They probably discuss it in terms of Indian football. Indian football wants to be the best in the world at football. There's no real kind of focus around Asian football. And I think that goes for most countries across Asia. And we see that in the Asian Champions League, the fact that it's still really not considered the pinnacle of Asian football. The domestic league is the pinnacle. And then if they're lucky, they'll have a European club visit them over the summer. I think the AFC have a lot to do about bringing Asia together. But unfortunately, I think over the last 6 to 12 months, I think probably it's gone poles apart and there's more of a rift than there's ever been. So the fact that you throw in Russia there as a potential to come down the pass, I think that's also going to churn up a lot of kind of distaste and kind of anger towards that. Unfortunately, the pinnacle for very many in Asian football isn't in Asia, it's on the world stage.
And that's a very interesting point to make and very relevant. And I'm sure the audience listening to it would resonate with that because the little few people who actually pinpoint the problems within the Indian football system, definitely either living or not anymore, have pinpointed about this issue of how we don't want or aim to be the best in Asia because that should be our immediate goal and that should be the goal. Yes, World Cup comes, yes, the international stage at the bigger level comes, but to having competing first in the Asian thing is one and then you go on from there. So, having said that, why do you think that countries, and I'm sure you are in a place at this point having covered and different types of countries in this side of the world, what do you think is the reason? Why do you think that we are so probably not giving Asian level of football prominence?
I think it's that westernized view, isn't it? If we're told on a regular basis that European football is the pinnacle, we should be producing players that go out and play in the European leagues, then looking in your backyard, it's not going to be the same. And there's just generally that Asia as a continent probably doesn't feel a kind of a united kind of front on that, in terms of you're not going to have East Asian players that are going to be grown up within their footballing careers to move to West Asia, because it's a completely different culture. It's either stay in the country that you're from or go to Europe because that's where you can make your better money. Money has a big thing to do with it. I think the AFC don't invest enough into the Champions League or the AFC Cup. A lot of it's to be based on the club sides funding themselves to go around. So I can understand from a very small club's point of view, what is the point in getting into the Champions League or the AFC Cup to bankrupt yourselves, moving around the country and so on. And I think you don't get that kind of pinnacle of seeing kind of where you're going to. And you can see that within the new kind of structures, the new systems that are in place with like the Vision 2037 and those sorts of kind of things, where the ambition is on the world stage. How do we kind of make ourselves known in the European market? And the big developments over the last 10 years of kind of leagues that are trying to kind of get to that next stage have all been, how can we attract the European market? The reason why China all of a sudden became big with the Chinese Super League was not necessarily to be the best in Asia, because they already were, or they could potentially be with Guangzhou Evergrande. It was to attract the European market, to get those players over to China, to be a soft power in that side of things. The whole Qatar World Cup and the Saudi Arabia pushing forward again is trying to have a glimpse of what has European got that we can have. It's not focused in Asia about focusing on that side of things. And even in the AFC, they've tried it, but only for very small times with the AFC Champions League reforms. They only brought it in 2021, the idea of open up to developing markets, big markets like India, like Malaysia. And that's changed completely to now the the Champions League is now going to revert back to 20 teams and be a lot more condensed and move away from those developing markets, try and make this product a little bit more appealing to, as we say, more kind of neutral and generic fans that want to see great football. They don't want to necessarily see their club succeed on the largest stage.
Right. Now let's come down to talk about certain countries or certain regions that are really doing well. Now we won't get into much details of every country or else we would sit here for hours. But I have a point that I was looking at, while I was preparing for this episode, and something interesting that struck me was, yes, you talk about Japan and you talk about the growth of Vietnam in the past years, how they have been up there, and Japan, no doubt, right? They've been way ahead in different sections of things for football. So, I mean, let's keep them aside for now. But what struck me also was the WAF, like the West Asian Football Federation, the countries under that. And that's heavily your Middle Eastern side of things, where it includes Bahrain, Iraq, countries like Oman, Palestine, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, all of them doing really well. And I'm sure they're up there in the almost top 20 of the AFC rankings. So, what do you think this particular region, apart from, say, pumping in money, what do you think that they are doing right on the field for them to be out there?
As you say, money makes a big difference, and that's from a confederation point of view. It doesn't go deep into it in terms of Palestine, for example, haven't got any money. Syria haven't got the structures in place. So some of it is luck in that kind of exposure. There's no real formula why Syria nearly got to the World Cup in 2018. They were within a couple of games of getting to the World Cup without a real structure, with being under kind of internal conflicts. They were in a war zone side of things. How they got to that was a consistent way of playing football in terms of getting their players into kind of neighbouring countries, going to Jordan, going to Qatar, going to those sort of countries. And that's where the kind of maybe the difficulty is within kind of India as a very specific thing. The league has got investment, but probably isn't at the standard that they want it at this moment in time. There isn't that incentive to go to kind of neighbouring countries. There is an ideal that we should be going into Europe, but Europe aren't going to come until you've got that development in place. And I think using kind of countries around you, I think development through the Champions League would have been a start, which obviously has started with Mumbai City's inclusion last year. It's very difficult to kind of move on that kind of ladder without that kind of sustained impact. The other areas is youth football, and a number of teams such as Bahrain, such as Oman, have really looked into kind of improving their youth football and having a little bit more structure to see if we're seeing teams qualify for under 17, under 19 level, we're going to see that kind of come through into the national team, the senior team. Again, going back, I suppose, but most of it's going to be comparison towards Indian, but Indian football hasn't got that, given the size of the country. And I know the size thing gets thrown out quite a bit in terms of the standard of the senior football isn't horrendous. It's not a case that we're at a level where there isn't a professional league, the structure, the investment's there. So why aren't teams qualifying for the under 19s, under 23s? I've seen, obviously, in the Vision 2047 kind of statements, they've suggested, we should be qualifying for the World Cup of the under-17s within the next 4 years. It's lofty ambitions when they can't even compete in Asia at this moment in time. So I think it's baby steps. Start to look at what's actually happening, the more understanding of the boring things in place, so the infrastructure, the youth development, and then you can start to actually have ideas of, we're actually going to compete with teams around us, and then even further afield from that point of view.
Right. Now, coming to the fact that, where India lies, now that, you've given me a nice segue into talking and focusing on Indian football. Indian football at this point is 19th, if I'm not wrong. And we have, as you mentioned, the vision that is put out there of 2047 and the immediate one of 2026, where finally now there is at least a talk or a thought of saying, okay, let's focus on getting on top, at least top five in Asia. Now the whole, even though we want to, there's probably wanting to play in the World Cup is still there in back of the mind, but that's not my headlines anymore. I'm not saying that just for a headline's sake, but to be, up there in the top five of Asia. But as you mentioned, without those structures in place, and yes, the new regime has just come in, it's been a while, so we have to wait and watch of how the implementation is going to happen. But on the hindsight, how do you see and where do you think that I think you've already answered in parts where the emphasis needs to be having a structure in their youth level. But how can one get to start with regards to when you have the resources? Because we've had people coming from outside India and telling us that, hey, you guys have infrastructure, you have the resources, why aren't you there yet? So, what do you think, and how do you think you can get there? Bit of politics is everywhere, but otherwise, to get work done, what do you think we are lacking?
I suppose it's difficult to say because it's such a cultural piece, isn't it, really? And I think India is that unique kind of element where it's quite a free society in terms of there is a lot of choice available. Football isn't the dominant sport. However, there's still a lot of infrastructure there. There's investment and there's interest given the numbers of people that are still actually engaging with the sport. I think you've got that kind of idea that you're looking around Asia and you're seeing the developments taking place, and there probably isn't that kind of association. You probably don't look at China and go, oh, they're very like us, we can do it very similar. There isn't a carbon copy way of doing it. In very many ways, in the south of Asia, India remains the pinnacle and will be the lightning rod behind any kind of initiative. So it's not the case that you can look at Pakistan and go, oh, they've done something good, we'll jump on that. Unfortunately, you're alone in that aspect. How I think, and I think that's where they've kind of struggled in terms of how do they define what Indian football is in terms of which way do we want to go. And I think that's why we've seen lots of disjointed kind of initiatives. A lot of changes happened over the last 10 years from how the Indian Super League started 10 years ago as like a franchise kind of standalone kind of gimmicky tournament to something that's actually worthwhile and actual structure, which it is today. I think consistency and patience is obviously going to be key. This is obviously the first year that we've seen the Indian Super League, then the I League, and having a bit more of a structure behind it. So I think patience is needed through that. And trying to get that balance, which all leagues are trying to do in terms of trying to get domestic talent and overseas talent working together and how that can get the very best out of the young players to actually bring them through. And I think that's where the focus needs to be. Some patience a little bit. And I think that we see that from the national team as well. There's a lot of knee-jerk reaction in terms of if we're not going to get into the World Cup, let's change things. Let's move on to new coaches. Let's do that side of things. Unfortunately, they're probably not there at all at the moment. And I worry for Igor Stimac isn't my favourite coach necessarily, but is somebody at least the AIFF have actually put their emphasis behind and said he's our man to go take us into the next World Cup qualification. But if the Asian Cup doesn't go too well, are we going to knee-jerk to something else completely different? I think the expanded World Cup qualification is going to really favour teams within that kind of mid-region where India are at the moment. Some of them will make it, some of them won't. There's this assumption that the likes of Uzbekistan, Oman, these sort of teams will be the ones that rise to the top and get those extra places for World Cup expansion. But that's not necessarily the case. The whole qualification itself expands. So instead of having 12 teams that we used to have in the final round, we're now going up to 18 teams. So India have got to achieve that, I think, to show that that's the next kind of calling point. And if they're having regular opposition against the likes of Japan, like Australia or Saudi Arabia, then that's going to come overnight. But the main thing is, or the big word for me, is patience and consistency. And I think the league structure is now getting to a place where it's correct. The vision 24/7 is a great vision. It's kind of mirrors to what kind of Japan have used to do in their 50-year plan. But what Japan have and India potentially have, and I don't know if it's necessarily a cultural thing, is that patience and that idea that we'll stick to the plan no matter what. Even if we have a setback, even if we have a really poor year, we'll stick to this plan and we'll still go through it. And I think that's what's needed, rather than jumping around at different kind of strategies, different league operations, etc. If it keeps the eyes on the ball, there should be start to see some kind of improvement from there. And then you can start to tinker with the edges in terms of a better national team coach there, a bit more focus on overseas players. But the kind of the end goal, looking at the vision, looking at how the structures are worked, I think that's the best way to go for.
Right. I think, I mean, you couldn't put it in a better way. Patience and consistency is something that everyone's been talking about. But for that, we really need to be patient and actually implement it, right? It's an action. You can't just say and then talk about, oh, where are we and why are things not being done. But coming to the countries that, India are part of, the South Asian Football Federation, we have countries like Bangladesh that we are closely looking at, who are doing pretty well, and there are some good things happening there because they've improved. Or it could be rather we've gone down. I mean, which is the case, but definitely giving them a pat on their back for what they've done down there. So, what do you have to talk about if you have to share something that, a bit more about countries like Bangladesh really upping their game? And we are somewhere struggling even to beat Nepal these days. So, what are immediate neighbors really up to?
In terms of things that they're doing on the ground, I think there's obviously very small kind of elements that have larger impacts at that sort of level. Bangladesh have got less expectations on their side, less resources to be putting into it. So small initiatives can see a major improvement. But there's still lots of negatives around kind of Bangladeshi football. It's just probably the standard of kind of expectation isn't there. And we obviously saw kind of have a small improvement under Jamie Day last World Cup cycle, and that's probably petered off a little bit. And I think that's where it's difficult with India being in the South Asian football. They're the giant in it, but with so much expectation, and they really need another giant in their small in their region, because they need to kind of hang on to somebody at that stage. And that's my fear for the AFC Champions League reform, is that we start to see kind of regional kind of developments not actually succeed in what they should be doing. My take on it, even though I'm a big kind of believer in smaller international football in terms of for across Asia, is to actually for India to start focusing on the bigger teams and trying to understand how they kind of do their side of things, and probably trying to adapt it to their culture. It's very difficult to be doing something that Bangladesh are doing well on a macro scale, is what I'm suggesting.
Okay, now coming to like probably the concluding pointers. Now it's time to look at the top five or the top big teams that are really out there doing some great work and for which they have been rewarded. Hence, they are called the top teams. And we often talk about Japan. We talk about Australia. If I had to pick in the order, it's Japan, Iran, Korea Republic, Australia, and Saudi Arabia. What are these countries that have done well? And being like the Asian counterparts, what are the probably other countries that can learn from these, which is more closer to home than looking out in the West or in the Europe to try and adapt, like you said?
So yeah, from a kind of who to follow as such, from a largest team side of things, Japan are the kind of the epitome of what everybody strives for. Nobody has the sort of consistency, patience in terms of achieving what they've done, which is now getting to the pinnacle of world football. I think in the next 10 years, we'll see them kind of real challenge for maybe even the World Cup title in the next couple of editions. But that takes a lot of patience, a lot of consistency. The league itself works as an entity rather than individual clubs vying for signatures and what have you. The comparison to that is Iran on the other side of things, in terms of they've had very little infrastructure, a lot of infighting in terms of political kind of things. But in that kind of striving, so it's a culture of trying to get out of Iran in terms of getting into European football. They've got a lot of agents and a lot of good routes for transfers, and obviously history is on their side as well. And I think history as well is something that Australia benefit from, in terms they've had lots of connections with Europe, with English diaspora, and obviously quite recently Scottish diaspora, and how they get footballers into Europe. But I think they're going through their own kind of turmoil in terms of how can we improve the league to actually start to represent what we're going forward. Because I think now the A-League's now struggling compared to other Asian leagues in terms of how they can achieve that sort of things. In terms of what India can potentially kind of look at, given their size and given their kind of investment opportunities, I think teams in that kind of middle region are always quite good to look at. Uzbekistan have put a lot of effort in terms of money into youth development through looking at real focusing on hosting tournaments, underage tournaments, and really putting the priority on those age groups to actually start to qualify. The big thing for Uzbekistan was hosting the under-23s Asian Cup. So with that, they started building a specific team around the Olympics and try to actually have an aim to get through to the Olympics for this generation. Obviously, that's a knock-on effect to what's going to happen in the senior team. And I think for the next 4 to 8 years, I think we will see that Uzbekistan start to qualify for the World Cup. Other areas where you haven't necessarily got the buy-in from the Football Federation, Vietnam have gone down a route where all age groups play the same way. Park Hang-seo, who's just the departing coach now, has played a symbolic way of playing in terms of very counter-attacking, but very kind of cohesive in terms of how they're structured. Moving that all the way through down to under 17s level has always worked quite well. So I think it's trying to pick and choose these sort of areas that work for Indian football. And they've obviously got the investment in play there for the league. And that's usually my kind of a little bit of concern that it goes too gung-heavy in terms of going for overseas stars. I think I looked at the top 10 goal scorers in the Indian Super League, and only one was Indian. And that kind of concerns me as kind of a long-term side of things. And that's kind of the opposite of what Uzbekistan have done over the last 10 years. If you look 10 years ago, it would have been very similar. Lots of Brazilians, lots of African players being in their leagues to score goals. They reverted that. The league didn't look too good for about 5 years in between, but now you can see the improvement going along. So I think it's got to be balanced in that way, trying to have that kind of balance between foreign players and consistent players. And I think it'd be interesting kind of how they go through for the next phase in terms of Igor Samac isn't going to probably be here for much longer. He's obviously got the backing for the AIFF at the moment, but is there going to be a standard of play moving forward? And is that going to be bred through to domestic level, to youth level? And I think that's where the kind of taking parts of Vietnam and Uzbekistan are probably going to be the key elements I would take.
Yeah, I mean, some really great notes to take from there. I'm sure throughout the entire episode, I am like the audience will have to sit with a notebook and a pen to take cues from this, because it's some great insights out there. Now, before I let you go, I have two more things. One, we are still connected with Indian football, which is just one of your response to a tweet by my friend's show, Injury Time. You mentioned he had a cheeky tweet from Injury Time, and they mentioned about Gurpreet Singh's desire of wanting to play in the Champions League, and he desires to play with the same club that he's part of now. But the whole discussion went about saying that would he want to play for any other Asian team that has more chances to play in the Champions League. And you responded to that saying, I can think of a few who'd like to snap him up. Well, people on this side of the world, which is in Indian football, I don't think any of us would believe that clubs around in Asia or otherwise would want an Indian player. But since you mentioned that, I wanted to pick your brains on that. Could you elaborate on it, please?
It's probably not as glamorous as you probably think it would be, Mesut. And we've had this, it's not necessarily just Indian football, it's other areas of Asia. So take, for example, Omar Abdul Rahman in the UAE football. At one stage, 5-10 years ago, he was the best player in Asian football. He was 21, 22. He deserved to be going to Europe to continue his career. But his ideals of what that would be a secure long-term contract, playing week in, week out for one of the better teams that everyone's heard of in Europe. And that's never going to happen overnight. And in this case, it's not going to happen that Sadishingen is going to head to, or Gurpreet Singh is going to head to Al Hilal and be their starting player for through their whole Champions League campaign. When I kind of off the cuff said there's a lot of teams that would want him, it would be going down to an Uzbek team. They would widely want if a Champions League team and say we've got a +1 here for an Asian player. Gurpreet Singh would be a perfect kind of fit for that. A perfect fit to go to any other Central Asian teams in terms of Istiklal, that's in Tajikistan, or even going to Hong Kong or somewhere along those lines. And we've seen those players at that level. So you get Turkmenistan players, Uzbek players heading to Southeast Asia because you can get adequate money, but you can also get quality football time. The money side of things will be the question mark for me in terms of India's got a certain level of standard of wages and salaries that are available. Will you get that sort of availability elsewhere in Asia? Probably not if you want to start and you want to have an impact straight away. But there's always got to be somebody that goes and makes that move. And there's been a couple of players that have tried it in Europe and failed. And you're always going to do that. You're not going to go to Barcelona and be the best player. It's going to take a while to kind of build this kind of reputation. But in terms of that individual quote, in terms of there's a lot of Asian Champions League teams that would be interested in him, yeah, I think there is going to be. But it's not going to be the teams at the top. It's not going to get into the Saudi Pro League. You're not going to get into the J League necessarily. But there are teams around from more developing leagues, such as Indian's case, that will want to take up these chances.
Great note over there. And finally, I mean, I never thought I would ever ask someone about this particular thing, but I have to ask you before you go. Did you ever think of Cristiano Ronaldo playing in Asian football? What is your thoughts, and how do you see that beyond it being a marketing stint? Do you see any fruitfulness out of that apart from just brand or a marketing stint out there?
I didn't expect it to be this quick. Obviously, it could have happened, or something on this, a very similar sort of thing for in the Chinese Super League, when that was starting to generate. The Saudi Arabian side of things is an interesting one, and I think it starts to tie into what the impact of the Club World Cup will have, how that expanded World Cup will look like, or what the follow-on is going to be. There's obviously suggestions now that Al Nassr have got Ronaldo, Al Hilal will have to go after Messi, have to go to Mbappe, that sort of thing. And I think that's where the next kind of side of things. Unfortunately, football turns within 6 months, and you need to get the next big thing. Ronaldo's not going to keep at this level for much longer. So it was interesting to kind of have him come. Obviously, he's not at the peak of his powers. It takes a lot for, and I speak this as an Englishman, for England or Western Europe to actually start taking these areas, taking them seriously. So that you've kind of got, on one hand, when Ronaldo was struggling in the first couple of matches, was, he's past it, he doesn't care, he's not putting his effort in. And then as soon as he scores 4 goals, Saudi Arabian football's rubbish. How that kind of knock-on effect and how you change that image is going to be quite interesting. And of course, obviously from a European standpoint, there's a lot of concern around sport washing and that kind of implication. So it's not desirable yet for that kind of movement to go on. But it makes sense when Gianni Infantino talk about a world club football game. While there's a lot of cynicism around that, when you look back to the World Cup only 3 months ago, even for European fans, what they remember from it is the quality of Morocco, the quality of Japan, these teams outside of their kind of bubble and their consciousness. A club World Cup could definitely have that impact. And as soon as that becomes a pinnacle of the game, that Barcelona want to win the World Club Cup rather than just the Champions League, then we'll start to see Asian have a kind of a place at the table. And then you can start to bring all the good things about Asian football in terms of culture and how the fans actually love football in that areas. It's not they love the Premier League, they love football locally as well. And I think that's the only time that Asia are going to feel like they belong on that kind of stage. And that's when a Club World Cup actually has something at play for.
Great. Like I said at the start, I mean, I can sit here for hours and we could go on and on because there's so many other things to talk about. But I think that gives me a chance to bring my guests once again and keep them, bring them again always on the show so we can sit again and talk about these few things. But Martin, thank you so much for sharing all that you shared. I really enjoyed it and I'm going to sit again and listen to it. And I hope all of the listeners have enjoyed this. Thank you once again.
No, pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me.
To all the listeners, thank you once again, guys, for showering your love upon our show. Continue to listen and subscribe and follow and leave a rating wherever you can. We are available on all the leading audio platforms that you want to listen to. This is a totally Indian football show, and a huge shout out to our producers, Idea Brew Studios, and our producer Akhil, and a sound engineer Aditya Anand, and the in person, because I'm doing it from the studio, the one who makes sure that he can listen to me all right, Siddharth. So shout out to all of the backing team as well. You cannot hear them, but probably one day we will do a chat with them as well. Thank you once again, guys. This is the Totally Indian Football Show. I'm your host, Siju.